Praise the Lord. Well, welcome today. If you're a guest with us, my name is Todd Pope. I'm the lead pastor here. So you just had communion with the Pope. I don't know if that's worth anything to you, but I had one quick announcement before we get started, and that is our annual meeting. It's our business meeting is coming up on Sunday, March 11th. The details for that are in the bulletin, but we invite all of you. Obviously, for voting matters, members are the only one that get to vote, but we encourage everyone to come. It's actually a pretty exciting evening. I've been to business meetings in churches for years. I'm just going to say ours is fun. All right, we try to make it fun. There are some videos. There's some business parts of it that maybe aren't as fun, but there are some testimony videos that get shared during that night that are really exciting. And so anyway, definitely encourage you to come that night. Now, we are in week 4 of our Mixtape series, and one overriding thought that I've shared the last 2 weeks and illustrated with our Star Wars Lego ship here is that, sometimes the picture, our calling is realized in pieces, but, you can't judge it by the picture. So I don't have the box this morning to show you the picture, but you remember, and this is still not done. There's still a lot more work to do, but we can't judge the picture by the piece that we're currently in. We're just in a piece of it right now, but we can't judge the whole picture. And so we left off having David been chosen. David having been chosen. I can't even speak this morning. It's all right. I'm good. I haven't had my coffee yet. I know. It's sad. I know. Because I spoke too long the first service, so I better get moving here. But we left off with David having been chosen, called from among his brothers. He was anointed as the next king in their presence, and then he went back to the sheep. And then King Saul, who was troubled in spirit, called him to be his harpist and his armor bearer. And he shows up at the right place at the right time when the bully Goliath makes the challenge, and David takes up the challenge and defeats Goliath because of his immense trust in God, that it's not the strength of man, but the strength of God inside the man that decides victory. Now, this week, we're going to cover a lot of ground, a lot of time in the life of David. But before we do that, I have a question. How many of you have had a season, you've had an injury where you've had to be on crutches? Raise your hand if you've ever had to be on crutches. All right, I can think of 2 times in my life I had to be on crutches. One time was in high school. I was at a discipleship youth camp, and we were playing basketball because you do that as a disciple of Jesus. And I jumped up, and when I landed, I had played basketball for my whole life, and I'd never landed like this, but I landed, and my knee locked, and I landed on all of my weight on one heel. And if you've ever heard the term stone bruise, that's what I had. It basically just feels like you have a rock underneath your heel as you're walking all week, so it was really great. And then in 2006, I was playing basketball. We have a theme here this morning. This is why I don't really play basketball anymore. But I was playing basketball like at 6 in the morning at the athletic club in Janesville, and I stole the ball, and as I'm driving down, I did a jump stop, and my knee didn't, and so it popped, and so I did what all men would do. You assume that it's like a sprain, and so you take off a week or 2, and then you go back to playing, and so I went back to racquetball 2 weeks later. I had my sleeve on, my knee sleeve, and it gave out again. So I took a week or 2 off. It was feeling better. I put my knee sleeve on. I played racquetball again. It went out again. And then I took a week or 2 off, and it was feeling better. And so I put my knee sleeve on, and I played basketball this time at Monday night basketball at our church. And it really, really went out that time. And then I finally go, oh, I think I have an injury. I don't think it's just a sprain. And so I went, and the doctor told me I had torn my ACL. Fortunately, I hadn't torn it all the way through, but I had torn it significantly enough. And so I had surgery, but not right away, because the injury happened in January. I got diagnosed probably in March. And I know one thing about Wisconsin weather is that if I have the surgery now, I'm giving up an entire season of golf. And that's not going to happen. And so I took off that. I had surgery in November, and then got to miss out on snow shoveling. Michelle got to do that so that I could play golf. How'd that work out? It was awesome. So, but anyway, I tore my ACL, had to have the surgery. Now, if you've ever been there, You know that these are kind of your legs, right, for a little period of time. They're the ones that are supporting you while your bones, while your ligaments are healing. You depend on them. Sometimes you can't put any pressure on that thing, and they're supporting you. Now, not everyone raised their hands, so not everybody's been on crutches. Not everyone's broken a bone. Not everybody's torn a ligament. But can I tell you this? We all have some broken places in our emotional lives. We all have some broken emotional legs, some weaknesses, some vulnerabilities, some cracks in our character that make us lean on crutches. Instead of on Jesus. And we depend on other things instead of on God. But unlike our aluminum crutches or our wooden crutches, our emotional crutches, they don't speed up the healing process. See, these will actually speed it up because you're taking off the weight off that thing that can't handle it yet until it can. But unlike those, our emotional crutches, they don't speed up the healing process. In fact, they slow it down. And so now and then, I think God moves in to take out a crutch. He moves in to take out things that you're depending on instead of Him so that you learn to lean on Him. See, here's the truth about our emotional crutches. Emotional crutches become substitutes for the Lord. Like we don't need Him as bad because we have this. Or they keep our focus horizontal on the things left and right of us instead of vertical. This is the truth. They offer temporary relief. They don't offer healing. They just help you to not feel it as bad right now. And when crutches are removed, can I tell you, it can be painful, but it's also necessary to be fully healed. Now, before we get back to the story of David, here's what I want you to remember today. When you operate in fear, you cannot operate in faith. You're not operating in those two dimensions at the same time. They are mutually exclusive. In the moments that you're operating in fear, and fear is what's behind your decision, then you're not operating in faith. And the same is true vice versa. And we're going to learn this story from David, found in chapters 18 through 24. I'm going to read all 6 chapters this morning. No, I'm not. I can't do that. My voice couldn't handle it, and we definitely don't have time. But I'm going to be condensing and telling much of the story. And if you're following along with the SOAP reading guide, you've been reading this story really this week. And the timing of the reading for me has been fascinating and helpful to read the whole story in context. So David has this incredible victory that we talked about last week in defeating the giant and defeating Goliath. And perhaps you've bought into the childhood fairy tale part of the story, which is, and he lived happily ever after. Right? And he became king, and he was mighty. And we buy into the story that is simply not true. Scripture tells a different story. David's reward for defeating Goliath and winning this incredible victory was more war. Right? He became commander. Saul let this young leader lead his army into battle, and David is incredibly successful and becomes particularly popular with the ladies. Right? They began singing songs about David, and their song goes viral in the nation. It hits the top of the charts, and it's a simple little chorus that goes something like Saul has killed his thousands. And at that point, Saul heard it on the radio for the first time as he's cruising down the road in the chariot, and he hears it. He goes, "That's pretty good. Saul's killed his thousands. I kind of like that song," and he's getting into it. And then there's like this, just a moment of breath rest, and David has killed his tens of thousands, and then stop the chariot. He did not enjoy that song anymore. And he is an insecure king, and he can't handle someone else getting more credit than him. And so he becomes jealous. And over a 7-year period, we have this cycle that is being covered by multiple chapters this morning, but we have the cycle of Saul trying to kill David. And he tries to kill David by various means. Sometimes it's by sending him into battle, into impossible odds, and against an army that's far superior, and he sends him in. You lead them, David. You take them. Take the hill. And David does, and God helps him to be successful. And David, as he becomes more successful, Saul gets more jealous. And he sends him into battle, and he's more successful, and he becomes more jealous, right? It's this cycle that they're in. It's this crazy cycle that they're in. And Saul even uses his daughter She's pretty, isn't she, David? Would you like to marry her? I couldn't possibly marry the king's daughter. I'm not worthy. I tell you what, David, all I need you to kill 100 Philistines. I know you can't afford the bride price, but all I need from you is 100 Philistines. You kill 100 Philistines for me, we'll call it even. That's the bride price. You can have her as your wife. And David's like, 100? I'm going to go 2. And so he kills 200 Philistines, brings back the evidence, throws it at his feet, and now he is the king's son-in-law. Insert in-law joke there. If you ever thought you had a bad in-law situation, have they tried to kill you? Literally. All right? If they have, I'm sorry, we should talk later, but that was the case for David. His father-in-law wanted him dead. Now, 1 Samuel 18:30 sums up this season, this piece of David's life, and it says this: every time the commanders of the Philistines attacked, David was more successful against them than all the rest of Saul's officers. So David's name became very famous. But things begin to change in chapter 19. Saul begins his first plot to kill David, and he lets his son Jonathan, who was David's best friend, he lets Jonathan in on it, because after all, I'm really doing this for you, Jonathan, because as long as David's alive, he's going to be the next king, but you're supposed to be the next king, and so I'm going to take care of this problem. And Jonathan's like, no, and he talks his dad out of it. And so David somehow goes right back into serving Saul. I know you tried to kill me. It's good. Appreciate that you're not trying to kill me now. And so he goes back to work and resumes his duties. 1 Samuel 19:10 happens, though. As David, he still has the job as harpist. And so as David is playing the harp and, calming Saul down, Saul, one, is kind of freaky that he's sitting there in his house, with a spear in his hand. That's just kind of weird. It's like, guy's not really all there mentally right in this season of his life. I'm not sure I'm feeling real comfortable that right next to his chair is a spear. But in the middle of it, it says, Saul hurled his spear at David, but David dodged out of the way, and he left the spear in the wall. Now, I think that's the most amazing part of this verse. David, the warrior who hit what he shot at every time, we've learned this about David, that he left the spear. Instead, natural inclination would have been, whoosh, whoosh, wah, and he doesn't miss, right? And he takes out Saul, but he doesn't do that. And so he goes on. So various plans and attempts to assassinate David fail because others, including Saul's army, Saul's children, step in to save David. But here's what happens. David flees. David runs. He is afraid for his life, and he takes off. So where is the strength and courage and faith that David leaned on when he fought Goliath? It's gone, right? He is no longer operating in faith in this moment. He's operating in fear. And how many of you have experienced that you've had a great faith victory or something, but battles come right after that, right? And you get to do it all over again. And will you rely on faith the next time as well, or are you going to rely on fear? What you see with your eyes, is that going to be the determining factor, or what you know about God? And David, in this moment, he chooses fear, and he flees. I like what Dr. Alan Redpath said. He says, I find it tremendously comforting that the Bible never flatters its heroes. It shares or it tells the truth about them no matter how unpleasantly it may be. I love that, because that's the Bible does. It just tells us the truth about our heroes. It does not say, like, David was a man after God's own heart, and that's it, end of story. No, it's David's a man after God's own heart, and then he fails miserably. In this season of life, in this piece of his life, man, he is not trusting in God at all. He is wandering in his faith. And then we're going to see that he's going to be successful again, and to God be the glory, it's always up and to the right after that. No. We're going to see he goes through another season where he makes some tragic decisions, and then he's going to be up, and he's going to have parenting problems, big time. Not only did his father-in-law try to kill him, his own son tries to kill him a little bit later in his life. So he has some rocky roller coaster moments. But think about the crutches that David and the losses that David is they're mounting in his life, and these crutches have been removed. David's position as this respected commander in the military, his position as son-in-law, which also would have been very respected at that time. He lost his wife, Michal. He lost her. In fact, Saul gives her away again. He walks her down the aisle again and gives her away to somebody else. Now, I know some of you father-in-laws wish you could do that, but he did it, and David wasn't dead. He just said, "You're dead to me," and so she's going to get married to somebody else instead of to you. He lost the stability of his home. He is on the run from cave to cave and from enemy to enemy for many, many years after this. He lost his privileged dining card at the palace. You know, you got to eat at the palace on a regular basis. And now, can I just promise you, his victuals were much better in the palace than what they were going to be out on the road in caves. I don't know what was served in the cave, but I can tell you it wasn't very tasty. It was probably in the shape of a rodent or something. Sorry. He lost his mentor, Samuel. He would go to Samuel, he'd run to Samuel right away, and Samuel and David take off in different directions, never to see each other again. He would also lose his closest friend, Jonathan. He wouldn't lose him in the sense that he was no longer his closest friend. He would just lose access. They would not get to hang out anymore. And so David's spiritual bones, his mental or emotional bones have been broken. But instead of leaning on God, he takes matters into his own hands for a while. And it starts with Jonathan in developing this plan on how to discover Saul's plan. And he begins by telling some small little lies in that story. And then a little bit later in chapter 21, the lies escalate. Verses 1 and 2 of chapter 21. David went to the town of Nob to see Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he saw him, like, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" Like, this is not normal for a commander in this rank, for the king's son-in-law to not have Secret Service personnel, to not have his army around him. This isn't normal. Why are you here? Why are you alone? "The king has sent me on a private matter." Bold-faced lie. Not an ounce of truth in it. "He told me not to tell anyone why I'm here." Bold-faced lie. Not a shed of truth in it. "I have told my men where to meet me later." Bold-faced lie. He didn't even have men yet. All right, that would come a couple of chapters later. So right now, he is by himself. So he makes up this story in the presence of the high priest, within walking distance of the Ark of the Covenant, which contains the second copy of the Ten Commandments, one of which says, "Do not lie." And within walking distance of that, to the face of the man representing God to the nation, he lies bold-faced multiple times. He's taking matters into his own hands. He's not content, though, to just lie. So listen to what he does next. David asked Ahimelech, "Do you have a spear or a sword?" The king's business was so urgent. "I didn't have time to grab a weapon." Now, does that sound very plausible? That, like, the one thing that's going to protect you out in the world at this point is your weapon, and you were just in such a hurry that you couldn't grab a weapon. But he asked, do you have? And the priest says, "I only have the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah. It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. Take that if you want it, for there is nothing else here." "There is nothing like it," David replied. "Give it to me." Now, we're getting the first glimpse of David's dark side here, aren't we? It's no coincidence that dark side shows up when he's running away, when he is in fear. David's making decisions based on fear instead of faith, and it causes him to look more like his enemies than it causes him to look like God. Think about what was said about him previously, as he was a man after God's own heart, because he prioritized the things of God and wanted to be like God. And now, in this season of life, I think it's more accurate to say that David was a man after Saul's own heart. He's grabbing Saul's weapons, and it causes him to look more like Saul. See, here's the truth. Faith-based decisions are better than fear-based decisions every time. And sometimes the decision's the same result. You know, you can send your son or your daughter to Christian school because you're afraid of what would happen in the public school, or because of faith, because you want a faith-based education where among their topics they're learning more and more about the Bible. One is based on fear, one is based on faith. Can I tell you that it's a better decision to make it based on faith, to say that it's a value not just because I'm afraid, not because I'm running away from something, because I have faith for something. So even though the decision, the result is the same, the motivation is completely different. When you operate in fear, you can't operate in faith. Now, if we fast forward to the end of chapter 21, where does David flee? He goes to Gath, the hometown of Goliath, to the king of the Philistines, whom you just defeated, and you've defeated in multiple battles. He goes running to the enemy. And so throughout these chapters 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, throughout those 5 chapters, there's one phrase that you will not see anywhere there. And it's this phrase: David inquired of the Lord. For those 5 chapters, he never asked God for wisdom. He never asked him for direction. He never asked him, should I do this thing? Should I run from Saul? He never asked that question. David inquired of the Lord is never seen there. So what it looks like is that David is focused on the size of his problem instead of on the size of God. When David faced Goliath, he remembered how God had delivered him in the past, right? He remembered the lion and the bear. He remembered those things in the past, and he courageously challenged the Philistine, announcing that God does not deliver by sword or spear. And yet in this season of his life, he goes running for, do you have a spear or a sword? He's no longer relying on the weapon of his faith. He's no longer relying on God. He's saying, do you have a spear or a sword? Overcome by panic and fear, he resorts to worldly weapons. Again, it's as if David is becoming Goliath, armed with his sword and running to his hometown. Now, don't you think these decisions probably should have been a wake-up call to David? Like when he opened the sheath and pulled out the sword of Goliath, like the last time he saw this sword, God used it to help him get ahead in life. It's pretty good, wasn't it? That's good. Thank you. I'll be here all week. No, but he did. I mean, yeah, he chopped off Saul's head last time, or Goliath's head the last time he had it. So, I mean, shouldn't it have caused him to remember that? Like, there is no sword like it. It's bigger than any sword he'd ever seen in his life or ever held in his hands. And so that should have been like, oh, yeah, I remember, like, that was the loser's weapon. Right? The sling and the stone, that was the winning side. But he's picking up a losing weapon because of fear. When he was in Gath, and he heard the people, they feared him. They said this, isn't this David, the king of the land? Like, they knew his identity better than he knew his identity at this point in his life, because fear robbed him of his identity. He forgot who he was. See, he should have remembered that he was the anointed next king of Israel. He should have remembered what made him great wasn't his use of weapons, but faith in God. He should have remembered that when you operate in fear, you cannot operate in faith. And here's where I believe our story intersects with David's story. Andy Stanley said this in a sermon: the ways of God are most unappealing and seemingly irrelevant when we are angry, isolated, or afraid. When one of those emotions, when one of those kind of takes over, when those things are taking up space in your heart, the ways of God are not appealing. It wasn't appealing for David to rely on his faith in this moment. He wanted a sword. He wanted a spear. It seemed irrelevant. His faith seemed irrelevant in that moment because he was afraid, right? And so David panicked and he forgot that God was with him. He was afraid. Why would he do that? I mean, he had such a great victory at this other point in his life. Why would he be afraid now? Can I ask you the same question? Like, have there ever been a time in your life that you look back on and go, why did I? Like, you know now, like maybe your faith is really strong now, but you look back and go, how did I do that? Why did I do that? Why did I click? Why did I call him back? Why did I say yes to that invitation? Why did I say that? Why did I spin that? Why didn't I just get up and leave? Why didn't I run away? But when we're angry, we're isolated, or afraid, our natural inclination is to panic. And when we panic, we forget. And when we panic, we make bad decisions. And when we panic, we fear. And when you operate in fear, you cannot operate in faith. Chapter 22 is when David's wake-up starts. And up to this point, David's not only fearful, but he's also alone, and that changes. Verses 1 and 2, so David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Soon his brothers, what's up? Eliab and Shemaiah and his other brothers now are following him as their leader. They're looking for safety, hanging out with David. I just think that's cool. Then others began coming, men who were in trouble or in debt, who were just discontented until David was the captain of about 400 men. Verse 5, one day the prophet Gad told David, leave the stronghold and return to the land of Judah. This was the first time since chapter 18 that David heard the voice of God. First time. First part of the wake-up call, God speaks to David. The second part of the wake-up call, not as fun. It happens later in chapter 22 when the sole survivor of a genocide attack of an entire city gets to David and tells him that Abimelech, the high priest, 84 other priests, and the entire city of Nob, men, women, and children, have been slaughtered by Saul because they thought they had been helping David. And David, in that moment, when he hears that news, takes full responsibility, like that's my fault. That's on me. Can I ask you that question? Sometimes the decisions in our life have a high cost that gets paid by other people. Mom, dad, right? That's just true. It can have a high price that other people pay. And here's the question. Who besides you do your decisions put at risk? Right? You're not in a vacuum. Your decisions have impact upon other people. Your decisions right now, high school or college students, could have impact on your future children because of things that you allow to take root in your life at this age, right? And parents, your anger or the way that you act or react or don't can have, right, ramifications upon your children and upon your children's children. So who besides you do your decisions put at risk? See, it's the ones you love the most, it's the ones that love you the most, and it's the ones that are watching your life, hoping that you'll be different. When David acted out of fear, he could not act out of faith. He couldn't do it. And he made decisions that put others at risk. In chapter 23, David and his band of brothers, they invade a town, or they invade the Philistines who were invading a town of Israel. But before he did, very important, he says this, or it says this about him. David asked the Lord, should I do it? And the Lord answers. And the Lord helps him. But David remembers this, that battles fought with the Lord's help, with God's leading, are better than battles fought on our own. Have you learned that lesson? It's way better to have God on your side than to just do it in your own strength. And so David inquires of God. He asks God for direction, and God answers, and God helps, and God gives him victory over the Philistines again. Then an amazing thing happens in chapter 24, and I said all that to get to this story, all right? Verses 2 and 3. So Saul chose 3,000 elite troops from all Israel and went to search for David and his men near the rocks of the wild goats. At the place where the road passes some sheepfolds, Saul went into a cave to relieve himself. Now, I know what you're thinking, and that's not correct, all right? He's not going to the porta potty by the side of the road here. He's actually taking a nap. He's going to relieve himself by resting. One of the things, the context of the story tells us that, in that, I'm not trying to be crude, hope this doesn't sound crude, but if you're relieving yourself in that way, nobody's sneaking up on you and cutting off anything off your clothes without you knowing, all right? But if you're dead asleep, if you're zonked out, then somebody could very well do that. And so, but as it happened, David and his men were hiding farther back in that very cave. Now, Saul is delivered into his hands. David and his men are hiding in this cave, and Saul comes in to take a siesta, and David's men are so excited. God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Verse 4, so David crept forward and cut off a piece of the hem of Saul's robe. I always found this verse really intriguing. But then David's conscience began bothering him because he had cut Saul's robe. This man had been chasing you and trying to kill you for some length of time, and your conscience is bothering you because you put a hole in his robe, that you cut off a piece of his robe. I'm like, that doesn't even make sense. Why is your conscience bothering you? Here's what I discovered. You have to understand what the hem represented. Like, it really important. Numbers chapter 15, 38 and 40 says, throughout the generations to come, you must make tassels for the hems of your clothing and attach them with a blue cord. When you see the tassels, you will remember and obey all the commands of the Lord instead of following your own desires and defiling yourselves as you are prone to do. Are you still prone to do that? The tassels will help you remember that you must obey all my commands and be holy to your God. So when David cut the corner, what's at the corner? The tassels. What's the purpose of the tassels? To remember that you must obey all my commands and all that I want you to do. And so he would have taken and cut the corner and cut one of the tassels off. And when he cut one of the tassels off, his conscience was stricken because he remembered what the tassel was there for. He remembered that that was supposed to serve as a reminder of what he was and wasn't supposed to do. It was supposed to serve as a reminder of God's law. And so when he cut that off, immediately he has this conviction. He feels bad. And his conscience speaks to him. Verses 6 and 7, he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this to my Lord the king. I shouldn't attack the Lord's anointed one, for the Lord himself has chosen him. And because the Lord chose him, he will choose when I take over. I will not take it in my own hands. So David restrained his men and did not let them kill Saul. But David has finally learned a lesson from his season of wandering, and I think this is a powerful lesson. He learned this: God will not violate his principles in order to fulfill his promises. God will not violate his principles in order to fulfill his promises. Right? This would not be self-defense, David. This would be murder. This would be assassination. This would be David becoming Saul, not king. And David recognized that. You know, sometimes the voices that surround us are not the voices we need to listen to. So he had his entire army telling him, this is God. But David knew God doesn't violate his principle. I've already lied in the presence of the Ten Commandments, and now I'm getting ready to murder. And so I remember that's not what I'm supposed to do. And so he doesn't do it. So David has faith, and he has his faith in the right place again. So his thinking was in the right place again. And he was no longer afraid. He was no longer angry. He was no longer isolated. And so he no longer wanted to take matters into his own hands. He had learned that just because you can doesn't mean you should. He had learned that we must be careful what voices we listen to. He had learned that doing a good thing for the wrong reason is wrong. And he had learned to lean on God instead of himself again. He had learned that when you operate in fear, you cannot operate in faith. And so one of the ways that David processed during this season of his life and during most of the seasons of his life was songwriting. You know, we'd say psalm writing, but he's writing songs. And can I tell you that some of the verses of the songs that he wrote during this season of his life, some of the verses we wouldn't sing in church. They're not suitable for worship songs, and that's what he's writing, but they were raw and they were real. And during this season, David is believed to have written a double CD worth of songs. He wrote 17 songs, we believe, during this season of his life. But I want you to listen to part of Psalm 58, which sounds like more like something that you would hear in a hip hop or a metal song in 2018 than a worship song. And he said this: "These wicked people are born sinners. Even from birth, they have lied and gone their own way. They spit venom like deadly snakes. They are like cobras that refuse to listen, ignoring the tunes of the snake charmers, no matter how skillfully they play. Break off their fangs, O God. Smash the jaws of these lions, O Lord. May they disappear like water in the thirsty ground. Make their weapons useless in their hands. May they be like snails that dissolve into slime. Praise God from whom all..." I mean, not really feeling the vibe here, David. I mean, he just raw and real. He was being fully vulnerable, fully honest before God, just pouring out his heart. But it doesn't sound very worshipful, does it? Again, I love that about the Psalms, that it captures just authenticity and realness, not just the Sunday school versions. Then in Psalm 142, which is believed to have been written, the first psalm written after the cave experience, it's a song he wrote because of what he learned in the cave. "I cry out to the Lord. I plead for the Lord's mercy. I pour out my complaints before him and tell him all my troubles. When I am overwhelmed, you alone know the way I should turn. Wherever I go, my enemies have set traps for me." Do you hear who he's leaning on now? He is leaning completely on God. I cry out, I plead, I pour out, I tell him all my troubles. When I'm overwhelmed, you alone are the way I should turn. Verse 4, "I look for someone to come and help me." Again, he's looking horizontal now. I'm looking for somebody to come and help me, but no one gives me a passing thought. No one will help me. No one cares a bit what happens to me. Then I pray to you, O Lord. I say, you are my place of refuge. You are all I really want in life. Hear my cry, for I am very low. Rescue me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring me out of prison so I can thank you. The godly will crowd around me, for you are good to me. David learned that when you operate in fear, you cannot operate in faith. And so David let his emotional crutches go. He let them down, and he placed his trust fully in God again. And God delivered him again. And can I tell you, David didn't learn this lesson for the last time. This is a lesson that had to be repeated again a few other times down the path that he forgot again. And before we judge David too harshly, have you forgotten a few times in your life that God and that faith in God is what will get you through? That it's not a crutch. It's not a thing that you lean all your strength on in this world. You know, because there's some signs that you're operating in fear, and there's some signs that you're leaning on the wrong crutches. Maybe it's striving to achieve some standard of perfection. You're just pursuing perfection. Or you say yes when you mean no. And you say yes when you mean no because you're afraid of rejection. You're afraid of to disappoint people. Another sign is you say no when you mean yes. And you say no when you mean yes because you're afraid. You're afraid of failure. You're afraid of success. You're afraid to step out of your comfort zone, and so you say no when you want to say yes. Another sign is that you just numb yourself. You numb yourself with alcohol, with drugs, with sex, with television, with busyness. Fear causes this inner pain, and a sickness such as a soul sickness like this shows up as all kinds of crutches. And these things numb the pain, but they numb it briefly. And when they come back, right, they come back in heavier and stronger ways. Or maybe it's you become a control freak and you try to control everything in your life because you don't want to put yourself in that situation again. And so you try to control everything. How's that working for you? It's only when we let down those other crutches and we lean our full weight on faith, on God, that's when we can have his strength. So how do we operate in faith? Real quickly, lay down your fears. Lay down your crutches. Lay down your support system, whatever that is, and surrender all of you to Jesus. That's how it happens. That's how we have faith. We don't have faith as long as we're walking along with these other emotional crutches our faith is at least really weak, we need to learn to lay those things aside and trust fully in Christ. 1 John 4:18 says, such love has no fear, because perfect love expels all fear. Another translation says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. That perfect love, there's only one. There's only one who loves perfectly. If you're married, if you've ever been in a relationship, you have discovered that love in this life does not love perfectly, except one. Jesus, who gave his life, who gave his very self on the cross for you and for me, he loved perfectly. He was perfect in every way. He was perfect and yet did not sin. He became sin on our behalf so that he could take our sin off of us and so that he could set us free, so that we could become the righteousness of Christ, right? He took our sin on himself. That's that perfect love. And to the degree that we walk in that, to the degree that we walk in his love, to the degree that we receive that love, we can be fearless. We can walk without fear, without allowing fear to control us. Does that mean that you will never be afraid again? No. But it means that in the moments that we are captured by fear, we're walking by fear, that we're not walking by faith. Our prayer team's going to come up this morning. I invite you to stand with me all across this place. So my question for you today, have you received that faith? Have you received that forgiveness, the price that Jesus paid? Every head bowed and every eye closed all across the room. Where's your faith? Is your faith in Christ? Do you have that level of faith this morning that you know that your sins are forgiven, you know that you walk with God? Or is your faith in church? Is your faith in faith? Those are crutches. The only faith that really matters is faith in God through Christ. It's the only kind of faith that can save us. And so our prayer team is coming this morning, and they would love the opportunity to pray with you as we sing this last song. If you place your faith in Christ today, there's going to be a slide up on the screen a little bit later that just tells you how to take a next step, and we encourage you to text that, let us know, so we know how to pray for you. But let's respond this morning, and maybe you're in a place that you've been operating by fear, and there's been some crutches that you've been leaning on that you realize this morning, like, I've got to lay those aside. I want to run to Jesus. And it's not a matter of salvation for you. You've accepted Christ, but you just realize there's some crutches in your life you've got to lay down. Our prayer team would love to pray with you over that as well. And so let's do that as we sing this song this morning.
Foundation, and I
Lord, I just pray this morning, God, how important this firm foundation is in our life, because even if we're on crutches without a firm foundation, they're not helpful. And so, God, I pray that you would help us to have that firm foundation which faith gives us. And Lord, that you would just help us to take steps this week to recognize when we're listening to the voice of fear. And if we're listening to the voice of fear, we're not listening to the voice of faith. God, help us to tune into your voice. It matters what voice we listen to. And so, God, I pray that you would help us. Help us to walk in faith. We love you. We give you praise. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. God bless you. I encourage you to come back next week as David becomes king finally. Pastor Connor will be speaking next week, so make sure and be here. God bless you. Have a good week.
That's quite a sword.
It is.